there's one TED Talk that I listened to that changed the entire course of my own career. A guy named Dan Pallotta in 2013 gave a talk called "The Way We Think About Charity is Dead Wrong." At the time, it was one of the 100 most viewed TED Talks, 5.7 million views on the TED site, although I think I might account for maybe half of those myself personally since then. But he talked about things, a lot of different problems that plague the nonprofit sector, three of which really stuck out to me. And is the idea that the nonprofit sector's impact on the world was limited by a lack of innovation, long-term vision, and marketing, branding, messaging, the way that we communicate what we do. And that really stuck with me for a few reasons, one of which was I had actually been hearing those exact same complaints a lot longer before that TED Talk. My dad spent his career as a nonprofit executive for different organizations. And he found the work incredibly rewarding, but at home, he would also admit he found it really frustrating. Around the dinner table, he would talk about these things that felt like cultural, systemic limitations and incrementalism in the sector. And my dad passed away a year after I was out of college, almost 10 years before Dan's TED Talk. But the first time I ever heard Dan's TED Talk, I could just imagine my dad just pumping his fist at these ideas. Inspired by Dan and my dad, I developed this sort of professional obsession. What would it look like to try to lead an organization that does use innovation, long-term vision, these different elements of marketing? How do you actually do that? I was living in the Bay Area at the time. A lot of my friends worked in tech. I'd gone to a tech high school. And I thought, instead of working in the tech sector, what would happen if you tried to address this by leading an organization? I had the privilege, a few years after that, of being named the executive director of CoachArt, an organization with a beautiful mission. We match kids affected by chronic illness with volunteer arts and athletics coaches. And the stories of the magic of what happens between the volunteers and the kids is really inspiring. But like a lot of traditional nonprofit organizations, the model wasn't very scalable. It used to take us, when a new kid joined the program, over 7 hours of staff time, calling and emailing back and forth with other volunteers to get a lesson between the students and an agreement to do 8 hours of lessons. So not a scalable model. But the founder of the organization, who had founded it 15 years before that, said, "I've heard this TED Talk by a guy named Dan Pallotta, and I'm looking for somebody who's interested in running an organization that way." And so I was incredibly excited at the opportunity. On my first day, which was our first board meeting, we together decided that we were going to set the ambitious goal of tripling the number of lessons that we provided for the kids in the program. So we started going about it using innovation. We launched an app called CoachArt Connect, so the volunteer could go through an online training and background check and get access to the kids who were in the program and contact the parents directly. This reduced the staff time from over 7 hours to under 7 minutes. So instantly, this became a lot more scalable. The pandemic hit, and all of a sudden, our volunteers were not able to go into the homes of the kids anymore, but we had built this scalable app. So within a few weeks, we were able to build video into the app, and we actually expanded nationwide in the first year of the pandemic, where we had volunteers in one city doing lessons with kids in another city over video in the app. Once we expanded nationwide, we overhauled all of our marketing materials, created new videos, created a volunteer recruitment funnel to try to find more volunteers and more students. And over the 6 years after we launched the app, we actually quintupled the number of lessons provided for kids impacted by serious illness. And along the way, we were honored to be recognized by various innovation awards and awards for the website and video and overall effectiveness as an organization. But one of the things that I realized along that journey, those issues that Dan had talked about in his TED Talk, the term nonprofit is actually indicative and almost even a cause of some of these issues. This has never been the right label for a sector filled with people and organizations that are dedicated to making a positive impact in the world. And I discovered it's not even a legal federal term. It's essentially a colloquialism that was developed years after the laws were created that established public interest charity organizations. And I was looking back at the TED Talk on one of the 2.8 million times that I viewed it, and noticed that in the little description, TED had written that a summary of Dan's talk included too many nonprofits are rewarded for how little they spend, not for what they get done. And I thought the word nonprofit sort of encompasses the first part. We need something that encompasses the second part. And so I would propose that as we see more organizations adopting these more modern approaches, that we need to adopt more modern language, and that it is a pro-impact sector is what we all want to be creating together. And that includes the organizations themselves and the public and how the public interacts with organizations. So while I was at my organization and we were trying to do this, there's a wave of innovation that's been happening over the last few years in the sector of organizations that would adhere to this idea of pro-impact. The FarmLink project was started by a group of college students during the pandemic, where they recognized that food banks sourced their food from leftovers from restaurants. But as people were not going to restaurants nearly as much, that flow was disrupted, but there were more people who were needing the food from the food banks than ever before. So they created an entire infrastructure and system to go straight to the farms, get their leftover food and food that they might not be able to sell at a farmer's market that might look like it's not sellable, and deliver it directly to the people who needed that food. The result was impact. 250 million pounds of food moved, 208 million meals delivered. Unblocked Cash is a program by Oxfam, where they use the blockchain during disasters to deliver the much needed funds to the people involved in the disaster, with a 96% reduction in delivery time for aid and a 75% reduction in distribution costs. Jacaranda Health is an organization that I just learned about recently. They built AI, as AI is becoming a bigger and bigger tool across all sectors, for expecting mothers in sub-Saharan Africa who have a hard time getting access to medical advice to be able to ask an AI-informed chatbot questions about the things that they're dealing with and what's normal and what's not normal. And we're able to reach, as a new organization, 2 million expecting mothers advised with this app. So, like I mentioned, having organizations that run that way is only half of what we need to do. The lifeblood of the nonprofit sector is the public, people who get involved in these organizations and these causes. And so I want to close with 4 ways that you can be pro-impact in the way that you get involved with causes. The first one is as a donor. And then I would invite you as a donor to think of yourself almost as a VC who's investing in the type of impact that you want to see in the world. A traditional metric in the sector has long been the percentage of money that goes directly to the cause. And while that sounds nice, I can tell you that if you tried to run any other business where 3% of your revenue goes to anything other than the ingredients of a restaurant, you're not going to be able to grow. And so a pro-impact metric to be able to ask as a potential donor or research is what is the percentage of annual impact growth, and what is their vision for how they're going to grow that even more, so that your donation can help that actually grow and bring about that better world. As a volunteer, traditional volunteer examples that we might have all participated in, a park cleanup day, packing food at that distribution center. These are all great, and we want to continue doing those. Skills-based volunteering, the types of digitally savvy skills that so many of us have, are incredibly needed in the nonprofit sector. Offering to help with a social campaign, to set up a funnel for an organization, do video editing, anything that you can do that's skills-based volunteering is incredibly appreciated by these organizations. When you join a board, very often in traditional boards, more so than in the for-profit sector, the board can veer into direct decision-making rather than empowering the team to be able to make these decisions. I can tell you almost every leader that I know who's worked in any kind of leadership team of a nonprofit has a horror story, unfortunately, of a board member who used that role to get too involved in making strategic decisions that they simply don't have the expertise to make. A pro-impact board practices good governance, and what that means is setting ambitious goals for the leadership team for the amount of impact that they create, holding them accountable to those goals, advising them on how to reach those goals based on your own professional expertise, and networking with your network to introduce them to the people that they might need to meet to be able to reach those goals. And finally, as an entrepreneur or a leader, the traditional route, and Dan in his TED Talk actually has a scenario about someone who, as graduates college, goes into the for-profit sector, makes a ton of money, donates $100,000 to a charitable organization, sits on the board. But I would invite young leaders and entrepreneurs to think about a cause that you want to get involved with and actually create an organization or try to run an organization in a more scalable way to actually make that happen, which I can tell you, I believe is the coolest single job that you can have in the world. The stakes of this are incredibly high. It can feel like the problems that we're facing in the world are growing exponentially year over year, or sometimes day over day, and can feel overwhelming. What we need is to create organizations that are built and have the resources to be able to scale and create just as much positive impact as it feels like the rate at which those problems are growing. And so I invite you all to be part of this, and however you get involved with any causes that you support, and creating a pro-impact sector and making a better world at scale. Thank you.